Thank you very much. When Andre Richter invited me, I told him I'm not an expert in open journalism. My special field is internet governance. And then he argued and said, oh, this would be interesting to get a perspective on open journalism more from the internet point of view. And so I said, okay, let's try it. And what I saw as the bridge to approach the issue of open journalism is the human rights dimension. And so I will concentrate mainly on this. And I'm very happy that Dunja started the discussion by referring to the very important Human Rights Council resolution, which was adopted 2 years ago, and which stated in a very simple language that people enjoy the same human rights offline as online. This sounds very simple, but this is very important, because I remember the discussion in the United Nations World Summit on the Information Society 10 years ago, when the internet was still in its early stage, and a lot of people argued, okay, we need a new declaration for internet rights. And then we discovered in the discussion that I think everything is said in Article 19 of the Human Rights Declaration. That means what you can have is probably an enhanced understanding, a new framework of interpretation or something like that. But there is no need to invent new rights, because everything is said in Article 19 of the Human Rights Declaration, which was adopted in 1948, and which has these 4 lines, which are here on the slide. And I read it again for everybody, that everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. And this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Any media includes also the internet, even if the internet was not available in 1948 when this declaration was adopted. I think it's important to, that's why it's important to look a little bit deeper into the meaning of this article, because it has 2 aspects which we have to deal with in our daily life. It has this individual dimension and the institutional dimension. And I think it's important to have this differentiation. And I start with the individual dimension, which is mainly the freedom of speech and includes certainly the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information. So the language of Article 19 makes very clear who is the owner of the right. So the owner of the right is the individual. So he owns the right. And it's not that the government gives as a present to the individual the right. So the right is owned by the individual, and the duty of the government is to protect this right, so to protect the ownership of the individual. And the other concept is the institutional right, what we call the freedom of the press. So I think this approach, if you approach the right to freedom of expression from this individual perspective, then you understand that the responsibility of the media is to serve the individual. Because if the owner of the right is the individual, then it's part of the responsibility of the press, to enable also the individual to enjoy this right. And insofar, these 2 aspects, individual and institutional rights, are interlinked, but they are separated. And here you see already, if you have this approach, that what is different in the internet age from the age where we had only press or broadcasting. So it's more or less the same, and there is no need for a new legislation. The second aspect, which I think is important, is that all our media legislation we have to protect also these individual rights and freedoms has been based on the technology of the, today we would say, of the 20th century. And these technologies had natural limitations, with paper, broadcasting time, frequency, and things like that. That means an article had only probably 100 lines or 200 lines. That means the journalist had to make a selection because he said, okay, the article cannot be longer than the 250 lines. So that means the technology and the limited space pushed him to select certain issues. Broadcasting time, the same thing. If you have just, 1 minute, 30 seconds to say something, then you have certain limitations. You had limitations for broadcasting time due to frequency limitations. So that means the technology was always limited. And this produced a special role of journalist, because the journalist was the guy who made the selection, who presented it in a certain way. So that means this institutional rights which are documented and described in the press and broadcasting laws were based on a technology which had limitations. The internet and digitalization changed this. So now we are dealing with totally unlimited resources. There are, you can write articles on the internet, with 200 lines, with 2,000 lines, with 20,000 lines. So there are no borders of time and space anymore. As the lady from The Guardian just said, they are now 24 hours, 7 days, 365 days per year. They are always, can publish whatever they want. So it's not the limitations that they have just 20 pages in the printed version of the newspaper. And this has dramatic consequences. And it's also the resources you have for publication on the internet are also unlimited and, even more important, non-territorial resources. What you need now to publish is just an IP address and a domain name. So that means then you can start. There is no need for an editorial office. There is no need for a broadcasting station. So you just do it. And an IP address is just for free, and domain name you can register everywhere. You have now 240 country code top-level domains, and you have more than 1,000 generic top-level domains, whether it's .com, .info, or whatever. So you register a domain name, and then you can start from this domain to publish whatever you want. I think this has really a dramatic consequence. And the understanding of the nature of the technical resources on the internet, IP addresses and domain names, is important, because these resources are not only unlimited, they are also non-territorial. That means while traditional media, had a territorial relationship, so they were hosted in a certain country, the office were there. Now, you can, an IP address, where you will find an IP address. The IP addresses are handed out from JANA, which is an organization headquartered in the United States, goes to regional internet registries. For Europe, this is RIPE NCC in the Netherlands, and they hand the IP address out to an ISP, and then, you get your personal IP address from the ISP. And a domain name you can register around the globe. I mentioned that already, that you have these hundreds, or meanwhile nearly 1,000 top-level domains where you can register just a domain name. It has not to be in your country. You can do this anywhere. So, and this fact that the resources you need for publication in the internet are not linked to a certain territory, has dramatic consequences for the regulation. Because you can operate a website, for the whole world, from the Cayman Islands or from a Pacific island or elsewhere. So, because normally, all legislation is concentrated on a certain territory. So, and these questions that the national jurisdictions is now, I would not say undermined, but is broadened into a global context, has dramatic consequences, and we are only in the early stages to understand the implications of this, I would not say disappearance of the national borders, but that we have to put this issue of sovereignty and national territory into this broader context of the globalized world. And insofar, the internet has really materialized what Article 19 has included as an utopian vision, with these two words. Now, indeed, everyone can do this. So it's not the privilege of a journalist or privilege of a media to disseminate information. So it's cannot done by everyone. And the other thing is, regardless of frontiers. This was also like a small utopia in 1948, because, information were always checked on borders. Then, with broadcasting, you could cross borders much more easier than with printed material, but borders played always a role in the dissemination of information. And this has now more or less gone. So if we have this situation, that we have this information revolution, which changes the basis for the operation of journalism and individual rights of freedom of expression. If we have winners, probably we have also losers. And I tried to check this a little bit here with a so-called SWOT analysis. So what is the strength of this new world in which we live? So that means we have unlimited information and communication options. There are no material limitations anymore. I think this is really an incredible achievement. But this goes with a weakness. The weakness is that, we have an overflow of communication, an overflow of information. That means the role of the journalist was also to make a qualitative selection. That means the journalist was trained to understand what is important, what is not important, what people should know, what people, there is no need that we publish this. So that means the New York Times always was published with the slogan "fit to print." So that means there was a selection process in between which guaranteed a certain quality. Now, if everybody publishes everything, so the burden goes to the end user. That means he has to find out, what is important, what is not important. And a lot of the end users are overstretched with this. So they do not have the capacity to make the selections. And so the consequence is, and this is a dangerous consequence, and we have to discuss this, that we, with more quantity, we will lose quality. So I think this is a problem which we have to face. And this is a problem both for the side of the providers of the information, and the media are still, the main provider of information in our daily communication, but it's also a problem for the user of the services. So they have to be trained in a new way, that they have to find, what they need, and not to wait that somebody makes the selection on behalf of them. So that means that's why media education already at school level, is a very important consequence from this. Where are the opportunities? Now, really, everybody have access to everything anytime. And, if we, in particular in the OSCE context, you had discussions about censorship, national control, filtering, and all this. Yes, this exists, and governments have possibilities to control the flow of information to a certain degree. So this will remain a cat and mouse game for the next 50 years. So that means if governments want to get the communication under control, they have their opportunities. Look to China, they have this Grand Wall, and they check a lot of things via scenic and things like that. But you can always bypass this, you can tunnel it, you can bridge it, you go to another server, you use mobile connections. So that means with all this linkage now that the internet goes mobile, and with you will find always ways to bypass this top-down governmental regulation if a government wants to control this. So that means this will remain a cat and mouse game, but the technology really provides you with these opportunities, and this is certainly a great opportunity, because it stimulates economic growth, it stimulates job creation, it stimulates more individual rights and freedoms. But the risk is really that we ended up, what I mentioned already under the weaknesses, in a user confusion, that the individual is overstretched with all these capacities. Probably, he has not really an interest to get to all information from all countries of the world, what's going on a 24-hour basis. So that means the user needs more or less the service that somebody acts on behalf of him. And one of the consequences is that we see the collapse of existing media. We see now, that traditional newspapers, regional newspapers, national newspapers have to struggle to continue with their business model, because the business model was based on the limited technologies. Now, if the technologies gives more opportunities, then, the money, in particular the advertisement money, goes where the eyeballs are. So that means that's the struggle for the eyeballs. I remember in a conference I was in 2005 when a guy made a presentation and that, people spent 50% of their watching a screen behind the internet and 50% behind television. But at this time, 90% of the advertisement money went to television and only 10% to the internet. And he already forecasted that the advertisement money will go where the eyeballs are. So because the advertisers want to reach the individual eyeballs. And so it's very clear, that means if the end user, moves to the internet, that the money will follow this, and this will, the consequence is to traditional income sources for media like newspapers, television stations, radio and so on, has to struggle with this. And so they have to adjust to this new environment. And this has consequences for qualitative journalism, for investigative journalism. That means if your investigative journalism, what The Guardian is doing, is expensive. That means if you do not have the money to do this, then the risk is, as a consequence of this fantastic technological revolution, that we lose quality. So, and I think if these two worlds, traditional media world and the new internet world, come together, we have to aware about the, what the regulation of the future could be. And here we have to differentiate between the regulation of the internet and the regulation on the internet. Very often this is mixed under the term internet governance. So because the internet governance brings the technical elements and the political elements more or less together. So because, as I said already, all these technical issues, domain names, IP addresses, root servers, protocols, and things like that, enable the communication. That means if you want to control the flow, you have to control the technical resources. So I think this is what brings the two worlds together. So, and for the technical side of the internet, we have already since 20 years emerging and growing what we call an ecosystem, where a lot of organizations are dealing with these technical issues. And all these are non-governmental organizations where governments play only a very limited role, as ICANN, the IETF, the regional internet registries, the World Wide Web Consortium, the IEEE, and other organizations. While the regulation on the internet, this is the services which are then using the internet as their platform, this is where we are confronted with the public policy issues. And the regulation here, the laws are made by national parliaments and intergovernmental organizations. So that means we have more or less, I would not say a conflict, but we have two sides of a coin where the code is made by technical code makers, and the law is made by policy and lawmakers, and the code and lawmakers have to work hand in hand in a certain way that the whole system is functioning. In the past, the lawmakers created the space for the code makers. That means in the broadcasting law, it was the broadcasting legislation which defined which technical device you can use, which frequency spectrum you can use. So they defined in the law the technical specifications. Now the code makers create the space for the lawmakers. Because, if you have a new technical code, a new technical protocol, then probably you can do things, with your communication device which we are unable, and which produces new challenges for public policy regulation. So I think this is really a fundamental change, a shift which has taken place, that the code makers now create the space for the lawmakers and not the other way around. And insofar, the only way forward is, if you look forward what the future regulation could be, including for media regulation, is that you have to bring this these various groups on one table, and they have to come together. And insofar, you know, this what is discussed now under the headline of the Internet Governance Ecosystem, that we need a multi-stakeholder approach to the managing of the Internet, where governments, the private sector, civil society, and the technical community are sitting together and trying to find out the future solutions. The frameworks which are already there is the Internet Governance Forum, is ICANN, is the World Summit on the Information Society, and the new established Net Mundial initiative, which has started just 2 weeks ago in Geneva. And this brings me to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. I hate to rush you. It was an exceedingly lucid setting forth of the complexity of the issues, and I'm eager to get back to the discussion, really. Thank you very much indeed.